An interesting question here. Someone is asking about the cost of inaction, and specifically what kind of analysis, both either in terms of mitigation or adaptation, did you happen to come across in the course of the audit work? Was it actuarial analysis, insurance industry, and also at what level did you see this? Federal, provincial, municipal, neighborhood? Is anybody looking at what it's costing to do nothing?
You want to start?
Sure, I've got a bit of an example from the Northwest Territories. I guess it was about 10 years ago when the Department of the Environment and Natural Resources was asking questions about how it could lead in climate change. One of the issues it was bumping up against was trying to cost inaction versus action. And it committed at the time to doing some analysis in that vein, but that was about 10 years ago. And unfortunately, 10 years later when we were finishing up the audit, they still hadn't done any work in that area. But they were making noises as we were finishing our audit to trying to do some basic analysis in terms of the cost of action, cost of inaction. And I think that it's a good development from the point of view that the government has to make some difficult decisions about where they're going to be focusing their limited resources. And the more information they have, the better in terms of making those decisions. That's not easy work to do, but I think the government, the Northwest Territories, deserves some credit for at least starting to turn its mind to trying to quantify some of those issues.
I would add that that's one of the real important reasons why you have to identify your risks.
Yeah.
You need to know what the risks are before you can figure out what are those risks going to cost us, in fact, if we don't do anything.
That's right.
And what are the risks going to cost us if we do try to adapt and deal with them? So it actually it screams for the reason why we need to know what those risks are. And the fact that at the federal level, 14 out of 19 departments had not assessed their risks across their mandate, to me is a weakness at the federal level. Carol or Michael?
Well, I mentioned before that we did have the information in our report around the flood risks. It was the Fraser River flood would cost, and I already gave these numbers, but between 19 and 23 billion. And the diking along Metro Vancouver shore and Fraser River shore would be about 9.5 billion. So there is information in pockets, but certainly we would agree that costing out of the risks is an important one.
So in Nova Scotia, to directly answer the question, we didn't get into the issue of costing inaction in this audit, but I would point out that, and why I think climate change or any environmental matters are important beyond this climate change audit, is that just before we did our climate change audit here, we did another audit called Critical Infrastructure Resiliency in Nova Scotia. And for webinar participants who have been fortunate enough to travel to Nova Scotia and through Nova Scotia would know, a couple key pieces of our infrastructure that we pointed out in that audit that hadn't been considered from a climate change risk perspective. It was the link that joined the way you go from New Brunswick into Nova Scotia. Essentially, if you're driving, there's one piece of land that you would go through. And also then our link between Cape Breton Island and the mainland of Nova Scotia. And we said in this critical infrastructure resiliency audit that the climate change risks around those two key pieces had not been considered. So if we say, okay, what is the cost? Well, you could imagine the cost to life, including the economy and day-to-day living, if something eventually happens to those pieces of infrastructure that impacts not only a direct cost to fix it and do something about it, but also the opportunity cost, the loss cost of what happens if those things were not fully available. And we gave those two examples in the critical infrastructure resiliency audit that we did. And that is another benefit I see of doing this collaborative piece, that is, as an auditor general and as a team here, we can think of these issues beyond this standalone audit that we're doing here, because it impacts so much of how we live.
I was going to add that earlier, another audit that we did was on municipal, on the funding of municipal infrastructure. So there was a gas tax fund that was at the federal level that was supposed to be given to provinces and territories to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, clean water, and clean air. And when we talked at the time to Infrastructure Canada, they told us that, in fact, climate change wasn't even part of their mandate. So we are, we made the recommendation that they should think about that, particularly now when we're looking at major investments in infrastructure.
Well, then, Julie, it's interesting. There's almost a pay me now versus pay me later aspect to some of this. An excellent example of that is in the Northwest Territories and in Nunavut, where the government has put in place thermosiphons around buildings to try to prevent the thawing of permafrost. It's quite an expensive technology, not only to install, but also to monitor. But if they don't do that now, buildings will further degrade and there will be additional issues, and it may very well cost exponentially more to retrofit or otherwise fix those buildings down the road. So there's an example where the costs are significant in terms of installing thermosiphons and maintaining them, but maybe you're saving money in the longer term. I mean, those are difficult calculations to do, but I think in the environment that we're dealing in, I think that's the sort of thinking that has to be done.
That's why it's great to have accountants helping us out. Oh, Carol. Carol had something else.
Now that you're on the infrastructure conversation, it was another example of good practice that we included in our report, was within the Ministry of Transportation, and they were taking a proactive approach. And we did see that they had estimated and ranked their risks that we reviewed. They were incorporating the requirement that climate change be considered in all of the design work. So there was a lot of work being done there that was good.
I have a question here from someone who's in the north who's pointing out that part of the challenge in the north is that climate change is not driven by the actions of people who reside in the north. It's coming from the rest of the world. So all the information territorial governments provide local residents on local emissions doesn't help with climate change. Have the AGs identified this as an area in which the territories need help?
That's one of the things we noted in our audit of the climate change in the Northwest Territories. The Northwest Territories is responsible for only 0.2% of total emissions in Canada. So they're really a minor emitter. But they suffer disproportionately from the effects of climate change. So what we try to say in our report is that it's important for them to focus on both areas. Yes, of course, on the mitigation side, but given the reality of the North and given the potential and I guess real impacts of climate change, they really do have to focus their resources on adaptation, because what's happening in the North is happening at a much faster rate than the rest of Canada, and they don't have the time, if I could say it that way, to be waiting around. An interesting, I mean, the question got at the whole issue of, do the territories does the North need support? The area of thawing permafrost is a great example. It's not a case of where thawing permafrost, that issue stops at the NWT Nunavut border. That's an issue across the North, and it's an issue that the federal government has identified. NRCan and Transport Canada have identified that as well. So that might be an area where maybe the federal, provincial, and territorial governments need to get together and think about, and this isn't really in our audit reports, but think about a way that they can address permafrost, thawing permafrost, in a more coordinated manner. Because the impacts are only going to get larger as we go forward. And the person that asked the question is dead right. That may be an issue, thawing permafrost, that is greater than any one jurisdiction, and it's probably in everybody's best interest to be thinking about, for some of these fundamental issues, a way that people can act together to try and better prepare and adapt for the future.
And we did find that in Natural Resources Canada and Transport Canada in particular, when we looked at the adaptation issue.
Yeah.
Someone wondering about the transportation sector in Canada, which is a big contributor to the production of CO2. They're wondering whether the provincial auditors looked at electric vehicles, cars, trucks, or buses, or any of the alternatives.
Well, I'll start by saying one of the examples that we found where we were saying that there wasn't enough detail was in New Brunswick, where the plan to reduce emissions from greenhouse gas emissions, the plan to reduce those emissions included putting 20,000 new electric vehicles on the road. Again, we didn't see any detail in New Brunswick. There was no detail on how, who, when, How were they going to develop the infrastructure? So we used it in our report as an example of a lack of information on that part. But anybody else want to deal with that? I don't think so.
Okay. Someone is pointing out that only Ontario, New Brunswick, and the Northwest Territories have 2030 targets to reduce emissions. They're asking, how come the other governments are failing for all intents and purposes?
So it's a great question. Why do, if you read something called the Vancouver Declaration, which was a document that all the federal government and all the provincial and territorial governments signed on to, is very clear that they've all signed on to the 2030 target. And so we went in to find out if in fact they all had 2030 targets, and we found that they didn't. So that is a great question to ask your government. How are you aiming? It feels like we're all aiming for different things. Even if they do have a 2030 target, they may be based on a different baseline year, and they may be based on a different baseline year or sector specific and or economy wide. So the targets are all kind of different, and so it does lead to the question of how are we as a country, how is Canada, how's the federal government and the provincial and territorial governments going to get to 2030 if the participants, the provinces and territories don't all have a 2030 target?
I have someone else asking here of BC whether using forests as carbon sinks is really a viable way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
So that certainly is included in the plan, but it has to be part of the full plan. It can only be one element of it. And so what I get nervous about when I hear some of the mechanisms that government is putting in place to reach the targets is it becomes too focused on one thing. But certainly there's an issue there. The other there are disturbances that are also taking place within those forests. So it's not as simple as saying the sinks can solve the problem. And we found that there wasn't enough focus on potential change. So there are the other issue within the forestry sector is there are a number of fuel treatments that are required, and they're not taking place within consistently across the province or within the highest risk areas. So the forest sector does have a number of issues, but that, I mean, there is no question that there is some potential there as well to contribute to improvements, as well as some risks that need to be taken into account.